I am longing to be with you, and by the sea, where we can walk together freely and build our castles in the air. Dracula never truly dies, does he? I'm Jay, and for this episode of Let's Read Something Gay today, we'll be looking again at Dracula and how it relates to the possibility of Bram Stoker's own sexual identity. So today's episode is going to be slightly different, guys. Usually when researching for these, I try to give a brief synopsis of the author and how their own identity might relate to the piece we're discussing, which one episode back is exactly what we did for Dracula. But while researching, I found this one really interesting article by Talia Schaffer, which actually outlined Dracula in a way where it was connected directly to Bram Stoker and his own sexual identity. The argument that Dracula was heavily inspired by one of Stoker's acquaintances in particular was really compelling to me, and I highly suggest, if you can, to read the paper through after this because it has a lot of additional interesting points that I'm not going to go too deep into. That being said, I did really like this angle and incorporated a lot of it into my other research on vampires and Dracula more generally as inherently queer figures, so we'll be going over a lot of that. But anyways, let's get into it. We did actually talk about some of the other possible influences on the writing of Dracula in the episode where I looked more closely at the book, but I did say that I'd circle back to Oscar Wilde in particular during that episode because his speculative relationship to Stoker actually seemed to run a lot deeper than I would have expected. If you haven't listened to that episode, I'd recommend at least listening to the main talking points about Stoker's life, since I'll be skimming over what I've already discussed, but if you're just dropping in on this one, suffice to say, we looked into a lot of writing in his personal letters and general social life at the time to show at the very least Stoker had a tendency to heavily idolize the men in his life. While Stoker almost certainly had some kind of affection toward Whitman and Irving, as we discussed, and that affected the role of Count Dracula in the book, those two bonds Stoker had in his real life were quite a bit more straightforward, since we had Stoker's own biography of Sir Henry Irving and his letters with Whitman to look at. For Wilde, the relationship between the two men seems genuinely complicated, from the circumstances Stoker would have met his wife, Florence Balcombe, to a dubious account of Stoker delivering money to Wilde during his exile in France, and so I wanted to take a deeper look at that relationship and how it could have manifested in Stoker's writing. So, Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker were contemporaries in more than one way. They ran in similar circles through most of their adult lives, attended Trinity College in Dublin at overlapping times, and held similar interests such as their shared interest in the writing of Walt Whitman and their adoration for Sir Henry Irving, but for all their similarities, Stoker and Wilde's relationship seems pretty tenuous. In college, when Stoker was involved in just about every athletic hobby available on campus and took positions in the historical and philosophical societies, Wilde actively scorned athletics, or at least, quote, manly ones. While he was also involved in the Philosophical Society, with Bram even proposing his membership, they didn't seem to have a particularly close relationship. It may have been that they were acquaintances due to family relationships, as Stoker was well known to have been acquainted with Wilde's parents, Lady Jane and Sir William. He'd often attend Lady Wilde's social gatherings, even coming to spend Christmas with them. We'll touch on the fiasco of Stoker marrying Balcombe as well, but this acquaintanceship seems largely to have been from circumstance. Close quarters, family friends, and similar interests in the arts. So what's special about it? Maybe they just didn't care for each other very much? Maybe, but it seems slightly more deliberate than that. After proposing Wilde for the Philosophical Society and encouraging Wilde to attend other events on campus, it seems like, at least in their college years, Stoker was interested in befriending Wilde, and the affection wasn't returned, or at least there's no evidence that it was. Later on, when Stoker had made a bit of a name for himself at the Lyceum working for Sir Henry Irving, and had started befriending other actors and artists at the time, it was clear that he was in a circle Wilde wanted to be in, and as Wilde developed his aestheticism and produced more works, he did end up in the same company as Stoker, with friends of Stoker's actively reaching out to Wilde during his trial at the end of the 19th century. However, in a complete list Stoker wrote of all of his famous acquaintances, which totaled to 12 pages, Wilde isn't on it. Why? Well, who exactly is Oscar Wilde? While I'm sure that there are many of you who already know pretty well who I'm talking about, let's get a quick rundown. Oscar Wilde was another author and playwright whose works we may talk more in depth about in another episode, also from Ireland as Stoker was, and a contemporary to Stoker. He is possibly most famous for his horror novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, but has many other short stories, plays, and poetry to his name. Before Stoker was married to Florence Balcombe, she was courted by Wilde. He ended up marrying Constance Lloyd, but was also put on trial for gross indecency and sentenced to hard labor in prison 1 month before Stoker began writing the first chapters of Dracula. Yes. At the very end of the 1800s, Oscar Wilde was put on trial for 25 counts of gross indecency, to which he pled not guilty. In 1895, he was taken to prison to serve 2 years of hard labor. Stoker published his opinions on homosexuality, advocating for censorship and punishment for authors indulging in decadence, as he put it, but he began writing Dracula's first chapters just a month after Wilde was sentenced. Gross indecency, in this context, is used to refer to sexual acts between men that don't necessarily qualify as sodomy, which at the time in England was a crime. While Wilde was also married to Constance Lloyd and had children with her, he was alleged to have sexual or otherwise romantic relationships with other men, including Alfred Taylor, who was tried and convicted alongside him. And to be clear, Wilde's trial is its own beast we'll have to look at when we go over some of his own work. There were so many separate issues complicating the trial and a modern view of it, from the fact that Wilde's interest as an adult man in underage boys was in fact wrong, even though it wasn't exactly what he was on trial for, to the class differences sometimes seeming more important to prosecutors at the time than their age, to the rippling effects the trial held in molding stereotypes about gay men to what they are today. But for the sake of this exploration, we're really only going to be looking at select parts of the trial and publicity surrounding it. While Wilde's personal life in relation to his sexuality is a lot more known to the world today, the case is not so for Stoker. Though he married Balcombe and had a child with her, we know based on the legality of gay relationships throughout history that this doesn't necessarily prove or disprove speculation about whether Stoker himself was also attracted to men. What we do know is that Stoker was intensely personal even in his writing, and that of his many connections, several were with queer men such as Wilde or Walt Whitman. So what of Dracula? Dracula and the subject of vampires in general has long been used to explore the different facets of both taboo and desire. In literature, vampires are often bloodlusting, deeply lonely, monstrous, and in constant search of their next meal, and in some cases even agonizing over the personal cost of needing to subsist on human blood. Dracula is no exception to a lot of these staples in the genre, and is even the mold other vampires in popular culture are made using, rather than the vampires of community folklore around the globe. In common Western European superstition at the time, vampires were bringers of disease, and while these vampire scares in the real world came from bloated corpses believed to be causing harm from beyond the grave, either rising to drink blood or chewing on their own death veils in the ground, the figure of Count Dracula is a little bit more refined than that. While some semblance of these more grotesque depictions remain in Dracula, such as his breath and ancestral soil smelling distinctly of rot, or the fact that he must return to his coffin to rest after taking victims, he's also articulate, cunning, and even compelling to some of the characters in the story, not unlike the figures real-life Stoker surrounded himself with. With Oscar Wilde specifically, there appear to be many connections we can make between the story of Dracula and Wilde's lived experience, as well as Stoker's own potential views on the trial and fallout of it, which were never directly made public. While Stoker never made it publicly obvious that he was an acquaintance of Oscar Wilde beyond superficial appearance, Stoker and Wilde had known each other for over a decade when Wilde was first put on trial. At the latest, they would have first met in 1871 when both were attending Trinity College, but Stoker had been attending for mathematics since 1864, and the friendship that had him attending Lady Wilde's social events implies that they may have known one another even earlier. It seems that Stoker attempted to make a genuine connection with Wilde, as we've discussed, but Wilde seemed uninterested in participating in many of the same things as Stoker. When Oscar Wilde brought home Florence Balcombe, this would have been the most likely place Stoker first met her. When Wilde later wrote sad love letters to Balcombe, he often seemed to frame them as if Stoker would also be reading them. When Stoker first became engaged to Balcombe, it actually took Wilde by surprise. He demanded to get a gift he'd given her, a small gold cross, but refused to meet her anywhere other than her mother's house. Wilde seemed to take a lot of joy in being the other man, so to speak, creating a love triangle that he participated in for years, but we see little to no evidence of Stoker ever responding. This takes us right back to the idea of love triangles through the lens of homosocial desire, the term popularized by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick that we talked about more in the episode dealing more closely with the Dracula novel. Though Wilde eventually married Constance Lloyd, he kept up his side of this triangle perhaps due to real feelings for Balcombe, but perhaps also to keep up a rivalry with Stoker that seemed to start in college. According to Talia Schaffer in the paper A Wilde Desire Took Me, The Homoerotic History of Dracula, Wilde was beginning to perfect his attitude of questioning conventional morality, while Stoker's morality remained nothing if not conventional. Stoker believed in manliness, chivalry, and bluff good humor. Wilde did not so much disbelieve in these standards as find them utterly irrelevant. They were just as much opposites as they were similar in their love for Whitman and for Balcombe, and it seems that Wilde tried to court Stoker into being his actual rival, but Stoker had no public response. According to theories about homosocial desire, the objectifying of the woman in love triangles allows men to express passion toward one another indirectly and in socially acceptable ways. When the woman in between two men is used as the connection between them, the triangle itself becomes more about the tension than it is about the woman at all. It's pretty clear that Wilde wasn't really in any position to threaten Stoker and Balcombe's relationship, though. Stoker may have responded privately, but we have no record to show that they ever talked about the engagement. Balcombe was clearly fond of the letters and cards that Wilde sent to her, as she kept them throughout her life, including after she and Stoker stopped having any marital intimacy. While Stoker was working for Irving the same year Wilde graduated from college, Wilde also held an adoration for the actor. He would eventually write some work for Irving and attended events where all three were present, but still, Stoker makes no public mention of Wilde. At the same time, we can see Stoker's coding of what he might really mean in writing as a pattern arises. Stoker was elusive in factual detail when writing, publicly or privately. When he wrote on censorship, he never named a particular writer he wanted to censor. Instead, he writes about reticence, discretion, and shame, the same words he used when writing his first letter to Whitman. What about himself would he feel shame for, or a need for discretion, that he would also apply to censorship in England, to unnamed authors? The answer may lie in personal reminiscences of Sir Henry Irving. While Stoker never wrote a formal autobiography or memoir, his biography accounting different highlights of Irving's life serve as one of the closest things we get to a first-hand account of his own life. In it, Stoker recounts a momentous occasion, Sir Henry Irving's knighthood. This would have been on May 24th, 1895. This was also the same day that Wilde's trial ended, with news spreading the following day. However, Stoker makes no mention of this at all. Instead, he talks about how Irving had the chance to be knighted earlier but didn't take it, and then apologizes profusely for bringing up the subject at all. From the book, he says, "I feel it too bad that one who in his days tried to live up to the ideal of discretion and has regarded reticence as a duty rather than a motive should have to speak openly, even after a lapse of years, on so private a matter, and I can only trust that I may be forgiven should anyone with the power of forgiveness see the need of it." Here again, we see Stoker's usage of his two favorite words surrounding men, fictional or otherwise. Irving was one of the most famous actors in the world at the time, and there are many accounts of him being the exact opposite of a reticent or discreet man. There is, however, the lingering question of whether he and Stoker ever became romantically involved. In Stoker's own writing, he described nights he spent in London with Irving where they talked about everything between life and art. In Phyllis Roth's Bram Stoker, she writes that for Stoker, Irving was, quote, the most important love relationship of his adult life. His description of his reaction to Irving's recitation is that of someone who is falling in love. In the last episode, we did talk about that recitation, and Stoker's description of himself as nearly hysterical in that moment, but again, we're seeing a kind of triangle, where instead of a woman in between Irving and Stoker, it's Irving's acting that holds that tension. Stoker can react to Irving's acting all he wants, because that's what he's supposed to do, just like men can fight over a woman. So here, we have another man Stoker may have had some kind of deeper relationship with, or feelings for at the very least, used with this same language. So in Personal Reminiscences, when apologizing so profusely for Irving's history of knighthood, while not mentioning Wilde at all, what is he saying exactly? Such overkill for revealing the simple fact that Irving had had the chance to be knighted previously seems like a misdirected apology. As much of Stoker's writing on censorship never mentions a particular author, even as it clearly refers to Wilde and his contemporaries, this apology does not mention Wilde, but seems more aligned for him than it would for Irving. In the same section, Stoker goes on to write about his summer, where he took the research he'd been gathering and began actually writing Dracula, or the first few chapters of it. This would have been a month after Wilde was sentenced. Now, perhaps this is just coincidence. After all, Stoker never publicly commented on Wilde's imprisonment at all, and he had been researching Dracula for years prior. However, that doesn't mean that Wilde wouldn't have been on his mind. Even though Stoker didn't speak up, Sir Henry Irving and another actress, Ellen Terry, likely worked together to send Wilde violets and a horseshoe for good luck. Both actors, as well as a few other friends and colleagues of Wilde's, defended him. Even Hall Caine, to whom Dracula is dedicated using the nickname Hommybag, stated after the verdict, God pity him in this hour when human pity there seems none. To think of it, that man, that genius as he is, whom you and I have seen feted and flattered, whose hands we have grasped in friendship, a felon, and come to infamy unspeakable. It is not immediately clear if Hall Caine is speaking in favor of Wilde or in horror of his own association with him, but his remark about a lack of human pity possibly references that Wilde was convicted not on the basis of the crime of sodomy, but on evidence that wasn't actually able to tie together a narrative of him. He was made an example of, and wrongly imprisoned on both the moral point that homosexuality shouldn't be a crime, and the point that guilty verdicts require sufficient concrete evidence of a crime, which Wilde's case lacked. In addition to this, Wilde's younger brother, Willie Wilde, sent a letter to Stoker dated July 16, 1895 that reads, "Bram, old friend, poor Oscar was not as bad as people thought him. He was led astray by his vanity and conceit, and he was so got at that he was weak enough to be guilty of indiscretions and follies. That is all. He is taking his punishment with manly fortitude, and from my heart I believe this thing will help to purify him body and soul. Am sure you and Florence must have felt the disgrace of one who cared for you both sincerely. I would like to talk to you." Whether Stoker ever actually answered this letter is unclear, but it's another example of how inescapable Wilde's trial would have been to him. For him to not speak up on the topic is deliberate, not incidental. And so, Stoker began writing Dracula. According to Schaffer, Dracula reproduces Wilde in all his apparent monstrosity and evil in order to work through this painful popular image of the homosexual and eventually transform it into a viable identity model. At this point in Victorian England, homosexuality wasn't generally seen as a sexuality, but rather a crime and an outlier deviancy. However, stereotypes of the homosexual man did exist. During Wilde's own trial, his crime was described using his art, and in terms of his deviant artistic and effeminate traits, rather than immoral sexual behavior, according to Greg Robinson, writer of Whispers of the Unspeakable, New York and Montreal newspaper coverage of the Oscar Wilde trials in 1895. It is also true that while hysteria was considered an illness that largely affected women, it was thought to be capable of affecting particularly impressionable and weak men. Because of this, it is clear that there is some existing stereotype surrounding men who were considered effeminate and artistic, and the association of homosexuality with perceived femininity. The identity model of homosexuality only existed in this sense, otherwise it was confined to attempts to diagnose the so-called cause of it, or to reduce it to a base deviancy. However, Count Dracula shares eccentricity with these stereotypes. He's a complete outsider even in his homeland where Jonathan Harker first meets him. His desire isn't just restricted to women. He doesn't seek to bed with his victims either, and instead penetration is succeeded with his fangs through biting. While the one-to-one comparison of sex to vampiric biting is slightly Freudian, in Stoker's own words, discretion is the name of the game. Hiding that which is considered base behind layers of fantastical elements would be the perfect way to make a monster into a metaphor. These unique traits are also kept hidden to ensure Dracula's survival. When he's first villainized by Jonathan, it is not because of any horrible act he's committed, but these oddities. Jonathan supposes that he is a prisoner in Dracula's home. With Dracula's request to be taught to speak properly, when Jonathan smells his rancid breath, and when Jonathan finds that most of the castle doors are locked, it is when he begins to view himself as opposed to Dracula, all before he's seen Dracula do anything that is actually monstrous. The similarities in particular with the first 5 chapters of Dracula and Stoker's own life only grow from there. Dracula destroys Harker's attempts to reach the outside world with news of what he's seen, as Stoker advocates for censorship of gay themes in literature by unnamed authors, as its decadence, quote, teaches its otherwise normal readers to experience homosexual desire. And in real life, even though Stoker publicly called for censorship and later the imprisonment of all homosexual authors, in several biographical accounts, he is said to have traveled to Paris where Wilde had exiled himself out of getting out of prison to give Wilde money. This contradiction between his alleged actions and writing continues. Harker and Dracula meeting in the first 5 chapters were the first written parts of Dracula, and they mirror the differences between Stoker and Wilde, or possibly 2 opposing views of Wilde. Harker is a man in a dedicated relationship, working loyally for an older man, and once at the castle Dracula, a man forced to watch silently as Dracula acts out horrors while he can only watch. Dracula stands more for the sentiments around Wilde at the time of his trial than for Wilde himself. In Jonathan's own diary, after discovering that Dracula cannot be seen in a mirror, he writes, "Coming on top of so many strange things was beginning to increase that vague feeling of uneasiness which I always have when the Count is near." From Jonathan's own perspective, he has always felt something was off about the Count, and after having this visible difference confirmed is exactly when his writing in regards to Dracula begins to shift from uneasy house guest to complete victim. Now that Dracula's otherness has been fully identified, Jonathan wants nothing to do with him, and will do anything to get away from him, which mirrors closely the sudden outpouring of hatred and disgust for Wilde as soon as the trials brought his sexual activity to the public eye. Wilde was fairly popular in the circles he ran in, and suddenly all of that support dissipated almost completely, just as Harker's opinion on Dracula shifts suddenly and intensely. While Wilde's image was effectively ruined and given the appearance of a deviant predator, Dracula is manipulative, secretive, and an eater of men. He corrupts people and controls them with both disgust and temptation. There are also scenes where the role of Dracula and Harker are both used to possibly villainize and pity Wilde, while sometimes shifting and changing to Stoker, a passive man observing the fallout. While Stoker's own writing vocalized his support of censorship, Jonathan's censorship is meant to paint him further as a victim. When Dracula holds up Harker's letter to Mina and announces he's going to destroy it, Harker simply watches on in dismay. The other is a vile thing, an outrage upon friendship and hospitality. It is not signed. Well, so it cannot matter to us. And he calmly held letter and envelope in the flame of the lamp till they were consumed. Harker then goes on to realize that all his other paper has been taken, and there is truly no way for him to reach the outside world without having to pass his writing through Dracula, who he doesn't know is even sending the letters as promised. This would mirror the idea of not only the censorship laws in England at the time, but Wilde's own experiences in prison, as all of his letters went through the prison governor. This passage sympathizes with the idea of someone only seeking to reach the outside world, with no hope of doing so unless he hides his true feelings. In this case, Jonathan has to present himself as respecting of Dracula and not needing help to escape from him. Even later, the interchanging of the roles of Dracula and Harker come up again when Harker physically transforms and becomes older, frail at first and then more strong, while Dracula becomes younger in appearance and begins to embody the Englishman, which he desires to infiltrate. A normal man and a monster have become one as they physically trade places. Even as this transformation occurs, Dracula is everything the public at the time believed the homosexual man was at his worst, a predator. At the same time, just like Stoker often tried to run the line between openness and secrecy, his story rides the line between identifying with Wilde's imprisonment through Harker's imprisonment and identifying with the idea that homosexual desire is monstrous in nature. Just as Harker remarks that a wild desire took him to retrieve a key to escape which leads him to eventually try to put hands on Dracula, the desire of Oscar Wilde is used as a shorthand for homosexual desires, and references to Wilde in literature continue to be effective shorthand for referencing same-sex attraction. In this scene, this wild desire occurs when Harker lays eyes on Dracula, who is in a coma-like state in his coffin. The idea here is that a man in a form of bed is somehow enticing or coercing another man to interact with him without having to say a word. Just as when Jonathan attempts to hurt Dracula, he is once again stopped by this gaze. Just as Harker imagines that Dracula will go on to create more monstrous figures and then to attack more people, the beliefs around Wilde suggested that he hung around in a bad circle and continued to infect innocent people. This also carries into wider negative stereotypes that gay people seek to turn other people gay, thereby effectively procreating. The fact that Wilde was made an example of was meant to symbolically end all homosexual interaction for fear of punishment or exposure, just as the killing of Dracula is meant to undo all the harm he's caused while staying in England. According to Schaffer, the first part of the book swings wildly between utter hatred of Wilde and utter sorrow for Wilde. Harker and Dracula also share many similarities just as Wilde and Stoker did, down to the fact that Dracula wishes to model his speech after Harker and adopt the accent of where he will be traveling to, and Wilde dropped his own Irish accent in favor of an English one. Furthermore, the imprisonment of several characters throughout the novel seem to pull directly from Wilde's own imprisonment, and the threat of imprisonment for those who acted as he did. First, Harker, who is trapped physically by Dracula after coming out and attempting to accommodate Dracula's search for a home in England. It is almost as if he is being punished for merely being associated with the introduction of evil into his homeland. Then there's Dracula, trapped by daylight and vampiric restrictions. Not only does this somewhat resemble the restriction of how gay people could meet one another by the shroud of night, sneaking in and out of homes to avoid being caught, but Dracula's personal imprisonment mirrors Wilde's. It is a forced pause to their lifestyles. Stoker potentially even took small details and put them into the story, possibly drawing from the fact that Wilde had 2 homes when giving Dracula 2 homes. Dates also seem to hold significance for both the real world and fiction. May 24th and May 25th are the days that Wilde was convicted and the day it was reported on after, mirroring the novel's examination of these 2 dates and what happened to 3 different characters on those dates. The importance of them in setting the scene is vital to the story, and it is unlikely that Stoker would have simply forgotten the other large event on the 24th, the knighting of Sir Henry Irving and his own brother. For this reason, it seems to be the inclusion of the date is intentional. Finally, one of the largest points of evidence in Wilde's trial were the stains left on his sheets after alleged intimacy with another man. This was then used to humiliate Wilde, with people such as Henry James warning of a stench. Similarly, the smell of Dracula and the dirt he sleeps on is often brought up, and when it finally is cleaned out, it is described as a purification. As Harker puts it, whether it was the purifying of the deadly atmosphere by the opening of the chapel door, or the relief which we experienced by finding ourselves in the open, I know not. Harker and the group led by Van Helsing repeatedly through their actions purify the area while they seek to destroy any source of power Dracula might have. This same concept of purification is described both by Wilde's brother in his letter to Stoker and actress Ellen Terry, who was one of the few people to publicly defend Wilde. When he wrote De Profundis, a letter on his imprisonment, she remarked that it had purified him, just as Willie Wilde wrote to Stoker that Wilde's imprisonment would purify him body and soul. Going back a few steps, this idea Harker mentions of a deadly atmosphere also persists, not only in the scenes of purification, but in scenes surrounding another character, Lucy Westenra. In Dracula, Lucy is in another toxic atmosphere that leads to her demise, not in any small part because of her own sexual deviancy. Lucy's character is a close friend to Mina Harker, and her introduction includes the fact that she is courting 3 men at the same time. While she does choose, she keeps insisting that there isn't a need to, and expresses desire to continue relationships with all 3 men in some form of real-life polyamory. She also takes on an additional suitor of sorts in Dracula and meets her end by her involvement with yet another man. This also mirrors, on Dracula's side, having 3 unnamed women roaming his castle, just as Lucy is courting 3 men. While Mina also has encounters with Dracula, she escapes in part due to her own loyalties to Jonathan, while Lucy dies tragically. This is similar to a view of homosexuality that seeks to present all gay relationships as disastrous and bound to fail by some means or another. When that disastrous end is death in fictional work, it also adds to the trope of burying your gays. For a long time on television especially, this was the only way any gay partnerships could be portrayed. So the fact that Lucy falls into this deadly atmosphere and dies for it seems not too far off from the real-life beliefs in general about homosexual relationships that would have existed at the time, as well as specifically referencing that Wilde's own engagement with same-sex desire led to his imprisonment. Stoker's affection for repeating words with particular meaning and pattern continues as Dracula includes several sensational newspaper clippings reporting on events in the book. Their repeated use of words like unclean, purge, circles of depravity, and the idea of letting in natural light and fresh air into a space that was made dirty or wrong to cleanse the space mirror the exact remarks made of Wilde in the news surrounding his trial. Just as Stoker chose words like discretion and reticence carefully, these shared words between real life and fiction would not have been likely just to be coincidence. Finally, Harker succeeding to destroy Dracula can be seen as destroying the idea of Wilde as a monster, or perhaps Wilde himself in an internalized homophobia kind of way. Was Dracula a direct response to the trials of Oscar Wilde, where Stoker himself came up short? Did Stoker himself have any homosexual desires, even if they were repressed? We'll likely never know for sure, but the connections do seem to exist. How could it be that Stoker would neglect to mention his contemporary even once, unless it was simply to distance himself from Wilde in an attempt to distance his own image from homosexuality? Maybe it is just coincidence, but I will ask just one more thing. What is there to be discreet about unless one has something to hide? If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow this podcast wherever you get yours and get at us on Twitter or Instagram at LRSGTpod. Thanks!